All right, so you guys really wanted to hear more about Rodney Bixler, huh? We're going to take a deep dive into his case today. And let me tell you, this story, it's a, well, it's a chilling example, of how sometimes the justice system just doesn't quite do what it's supposed to, and people end up paying the price. To get into this, we've got some excerpts from Bixler's Wikipedia page and some newspaper clippings as well. And let me tell you what you're about to hear. It's pretty disturbing.
It's interesting. Bixler's case, it's not just like, your typical serial killer story. It
Hmm.
really makes you think about all the what ifs. Like, were there points along the way where things could have been different? Could somebody have intervened? Could the system have stopped him before before it got to murder?
I know what you mean. Because, I mean, before all this, even before he was really on anyone's radar as a potential serial killer, he was already popping up, in police reports.
Right.
Like back in 1999, he was actually acquitted of rape and sodomy of a 17-year-old girl. I mean, how do you think that acquittal might have impacted him psychologically, I mean?
Well, yeah, it's hard to say for sure what goes on in someone's mind, right? But acquittals like that, I think they can be a real double-edged sword. On the one hand, you could say, well, the system worked. There wasn't enough evidence to convict, so he walked free. But on the other hand, for someone who maybe did do it, walking free like that, it can give them this feeling of invincibility, like they're above the law. Like they can get away with anything.
And it seems like, with Bixler at least, that's exactly what happened. Like later that same year, he gets convicted on 6 counts of misusing an ATM card. And get this, he only served 6 months. 6 months for 6 counts. That doesn't seem like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like very much, does it?
Yeah, 6 months does seem, I don't know, maybe a bit light considering, 6 separate offenses.
Yeah.
And it does make you wonder, what if he'd gotten a tougher sentence back then? Maybe a real consequence instead of just a slap on the wrist. Would it have changed things? I mean, we can't know for sure, obviously, but it's a question worth asking, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the system kind of gave him a warning shot, but he just kept pushing further.
Yeah. And while sadly, pushing further eventually led to murder.
Exactly. It was just a few months later, February of 2000. 67-year-old Thelma Cornett was found strangled in her apartment. This was in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. And that's where we really start to see this pattern emerge. Older women, it seems, that became, I guess, Bixler's preferred victim type.
Right. And, with serial killers, it's interesting. The victims, who they choose, it often tells us something about the killer themselves,
Yeah.
their psychology, what motivates them, maybe even what they're afraid of.
So it's almost like by understanding the victims better, we can get a better understanding of, the killer.
Exactly. It's all part of the puzzle, right?
Wow, okay. So we have this brutal murder. Then in July of 2000, there's another case. 18-year-old Stephanie Ann Clonch drowns in the Kentucky River. Bixler, he was a suspect, but he was never actually charged. And this one stands out to me because she's so much younger, right? It's different from his usual victims.
Right. It does seem to deviate from the pattern. Yeah. And that just brings up more questions, doesn't it? Was this like a crime of opportunity?
Yeah.
Or was he, maybe branching out, experimenting, trying different kinds of victims? Or was it something else entirely?
It's like, trying to get inside the head of a predator.
Yeah,
Not a
no,
very pleasant thought, is it?
it's definitely unsettling, yeah.
Yeah.
And sadly, the violence, it didn't end there.
No, it didn't. Just a few weeks later, in August of 2000, a woman in Lexington, she survives this horrific attack. Bixler rapes her, tries to strangle her, and then, get this, he sets her bedroom on fire. It's like with every crime, the brutality, it just keeps escalating.
Absolutely. And that's something we unfortunately see with a lot of serial offenders.
Mhm.
The violence, it escalates. The methods get more and more depraved.
Yeah.
It's almost like they need to keep pushing further. Like they need
Yeah.
to do more each time to get the same, I don't know, the same thrill or whatever it is that drives them.
It's a pretty disturbing thought, isn't it? And as we'll see, the violence, it doesn't stop there. And the violence continues, right? On October 7th of 2000, there's another murder. 27-year-old Heather Wright. She was working as a sex worker, and they found her body in a stream. She'd been strangled, like some of the other victims. But what's different here is that, well, she doesn't fit Bixler's usual pattern, right? I mean, she wasn't an older woman.
Yeah, that's right. This one is kind of a curveball, isn't it?
It is. So what do you think? Why the change?
Well, there are a couple of possibilities, I guess. It could be that he was, I don't know, maybe getting desperate, feeling the pressure after the last few attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it was just a crime of opportunity. I mean, sadly, because of the nature of their work, sex workers can be especially vulnerable.
Yeah, that's true. Sadly, this wasn't the end either. Just a couple of weeks later, there's another murder. This time it's 67-year-old Daisy Whitaker. She was found strangled in her bathtub, and her car, it was gone, stolen. And this actually turned out to be, well, a pretty big turning point in the case.
You got that right. Stealing the car, that was a big mistake. It gave the police a direct link to Bixler, a real, tangible piece of evidence that tied him to the scene.
And that evidence, it led to an arrest. A few weeks later, on November 1st, 2000, they finally catch Bixler, and they charge him with Whitaker's murder, the rape of that woman in Lexington, and also statutory rape of a few teenage girls. So, I gotta ask, for those of us who aren't exactly legal experts, what exactly is statutory rape? What makes it different from other types of rape?
Sure, so statutory rape, it basically means that an adult had sex with someone who's underage. Even if the minor seems to be okay with it, the law says they can't consent because of their age. They're not old enough to make that kind of decision.
So even if the younger person says they wanted to, it doesn't matter. The adult is always in the wrong.
That's right. The idea is to protect minors from being exploited.
Okay, that makes sense. So Bixler's finally facing some serious charges. But getting a conviction, getting a sentence that fits the crimes, well, that was a whole other challenge.
It really was. The first trial, they focused on the murder of Daisy Whitaker. And even though a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, they got a conviction. Bixler was sentenced to 29 years for the murder, plus another 6 for the statutory rapes.
29 years. Wow, that's a long time. But it's amazing to me that they could get a conviction with mostly circumstantial evidence. How do you even, how do prosecutors build a case without things like, DNA or fingerprints?
It takes a lot of skill, for sure. It's about building a narrative, connecting the dots between the suspect and the crime. They use witness testimony, timelines, and whatever physical evidence they do have. The goal is to convince the jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the suspect is guilty.
It's like a giant puzzle, isn't it?
Exactly, a very serious puzzle.
And the puzzle gets even more complicated a few years later. In 2005, Bixler pleads guilty to arson for that attack in Lexington where he set the woman's bedroom on fire. That added another 10 years to his sentence, so now he's looking at 45 years total.
Right. But then, things take a really unexpected turn. In 2008, Bixler enters what's called an Alford plea for the murders of Thelma Cornett and Heather Wright.
An Alford plea? Now that's something I haven't heard of before. What is that?
That's a pretty interesting legal strategy. Basically, Bixler's saying, okay, I'm maintaining my innocence, but I realize the prosecution probably has enough evidence to convict me. It's like he's saying, I didn't do it, but I know I'd likely be found guilty anyway if we go to trial.
So it's a way of avoiding a trial and maybe getting a longer sentence.
You got it. It's a calculated risk. So, with these Alford pleas, Bixler gets 2 more 20-year sentences, but they run concurrently with his current sentence.
So even though he's just been convicted of 2 more murders, his total sentence doesn't actually change.
Yep, that's right. Even though he's suspected of at least 3 murders, Bixler's sentence stays at 45 years.
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around, But here's the really unsettling part. Bixler was actually eligible for parole back in January of this year, 2024.
I know, it's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think about the whole parole system, doesn't it? Does it really work? Does it protect people? Does it serve justice?
Can you explain how it works? Like, what does the parole board look at when they're deciding whether to release someone like Bixler?
Well, they take a lot of things into consideration, like the nature of the crimes, how the inmate's been behaving in prison, if they've participated in rehab programs, psychological evaluations, if they show remorse for what they've done. It's a pretty complex process.
So it's not just about the time they've served, right? It's also about whether they're still a danger to the public.
Exactly. The parole board's main concern is public safety. They have to balance the inmate's right to a second chance with the risk of them committing more crimes if they're released.
That's a lot of responsibility. So what do you think? Based on everything we know about Bixler, how likely is it that he would get parole?
Honestly, I'd say the chances are pretty slim, given the brutality of his crimes, the number of victims, that pattern of escalating violence. I just don't see them letting him out.
That's good to hear, at least. But what happens if they do deny him parole? How much longer would he actually stay in prison?
Well, right now, his release date is set for September 21, 2039. But there's a catch. If he doesn't behave himself in prison, that date could be pushed back. He could end up staying locked up until March 3, 2045.
Wow, so he could still be out there someday. That's a scary thought.
It is, and it makes you think, what's the point of prison, right? Is it just about punishment? Or is it about trying to help these guys change, to rehabilitate them so they can actually function in society?
Big questions. And I think they're questions that go way beyond just this one case. So before we wrap things up, what are some of the big takeaways you'd want our listeners to remember about Bixler?
I think the biggest one is how easily things can slip through the cracks, Like with those ATM card charges. He got off easy, and it seems like that just emboldened him. It's a reminder that sometimes the system fails and people pay the price.
It's like those cracks in the system we were talking about at the beginning.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget the victims. These were real people whose lives were cut short.
Right. It's easy to get lost in all the legal details, but we can't forget the human cost.
Absolutely. Their stories matter.
So before we move on, is there anything else you think our listeners should think about? Maybe something they could look into on their own?
I think that Alfred plea is really fascinating. It's not something you hear about every day, and it raises all sorts of questions about guilt, innocence, and how the justice system really works.
Right.
I'd encourage everyone listening to dig into that a bit more.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I bet our listeners will find that really interesting. Yeah, it really is fascinating. It just goes to show, even cases that seem pretty straightforward, on the surface, there's always more to the story.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, the more you learn about true crime, the more you start to see these, I don't know, these patterns, I guess, like how so many of these cases, they're tied to bigger issues like poverty or lack of access to mental health care. Those things, they can really contribute to criminal behavior. And then there's the whole issue of systemic bias, how that affects everything from how the police do their jobs to, how sentences are handed down.
Yeah, it's like you start pulling on one thread, and then this whole, I don't know, this whole tapestry of interconnected problems, it just unravels.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's what makes these deep dives so interesting. It's not just about one case, one crime.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the bigger picture, what's really going on in our society and how can we make things better.
Exactly. So if you're listening out there and this conversation has, kind of piqued your interest, don't stop here. There are so many other cases out there, just like Bixler's, cases that will make you think, make you question everything you thought you knew about crime and punishment and, what justice really means.
And remember, true crime, it's not just about, some morbid curiosity. It's about understanding people, why they do the things they do. What are the consequences of those choices? And ultimately, how can we as a society, how can we create a world that's safer, a world where justice is actually served?
It's about asking those hard questions and demanding more from our systems.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been, I don't know about you, but this has been quite a journey for me. A deep dive into a really dark part of Kentucky's history. And honestly, it's left me with a lot of mixed emotions, I guess. Sadness for the victims, of course. Frustration, that the system failed in so many ways. But also, I think, a little bit of hope. Hope that by learning about these cases, by really understanding what went wrong, maybe we can prevent something like this from happening again.
I agree. It's tough stuff, for sure, but it's important. And it's always a privilege, to be able to talk about these things with you.
Likewise. And to everyone listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the case of Rodney Bixler. It's been a disturbing story, but hopefully an insightful one. Keep exploring the world of true crime, if that's your thing. But always remember the human stories at the heart of it all. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.